Okay, so we are talking about Augustine's The City of God. Last week, I talked about an overview of what the City of God is and why it's so important, and why, even about 1500 years later, we're still talking about it in the church, and why it matters, and all the things that kind of happened in that time. And just as a quick recap, this book that is still kind of in the backbone of Western civilization was written around the 5th century, after Rome, the city of Rome, the nation of Rome, the empire of Rome fell. And Augustine wrote The City of God in a response to how an empire so large as Rome could fall. And what does that mean? And so he wrote about two cities: the city of God and the earthly city, or the heavenly city and the earthly city. And he said the city of God and the city of the earth, or the earthly city, are bound by two loves: love of God for the heavenly city, and love for self in the earthly city. And so then he takes all this time to unpack what that means. And so for today's video, we're going to look at the first 10 books briefly. This will matter because Augustine is creating an argument uh, where he is trying to show the reader what the city of the earth, or the earthly city, looks like, and why, in the end, the earthly city doesn't end up working out the way that we would hope to. It's a theology of fallenness, of sin, that we would call that in the church, but Augustine looks at it not differently, but more thoroughly. So we're going to look at the first 10 books today, and then in the next video, we're going to look at the last 12 books, more about the heavenly city and how we respond to the earthly city that in the end can't support us in the way that we would have wanted to, and how the heavenly city actually can. So the first 10 books, Augustine kind of holistically, thoroughly looks at the city of and the empire of Rome. He looks at it politically and philosophically. He looks at it historically. He looks at it culturally. He looks at it anthropologically, how humans react in situations. He looks at it personally. He looks at it societally. There's not really an angle in the first 10 books that Augustine does not use to look at the earthly city. Almost any way that you can look at culture, he does. And that's why it's such a lasting book. That's why people continue to go back to it. That's why I've written about 18 blogs on it, and am doing this video on it, because it helps us to understand culture because of Augustine's thorough treatment of it. He calls out authors and historians and philosophers regarding their thought processes, regarding what they actually think. He surgically points to them. If you read even a chapter, take a chapter and take a look at it, he surgically goes through thought processes of different authors and different politicians to understand the culture. And so by the time you get through the first 10 books, you realize that Augustine really knows his culture. He knows the world in which he lives. He's walked the streets, he's thought through their thought process. And what's important to realize about all of this is that Augustine is not standing outside from the culture and critiquing it. He's not just pointing a finger and saying this is everything that's wrong with the culture. Augustine is standing right in the middle of it. And it's important to recognize that difference, that when he critiques it through the first 10 books thoroughly, he's standing in the middle of it. He knows it. He knows it. He's read it. He's thought about it. He's talked to people. He understands it. And then from that place, he shows the reader why it'll never work. It's important for us as a church to realize and think about the way that we interact in our own culture today. That it's easy to pull ourselves away from and point to something as being wrong. But it's another thing entirely to stand in it, to stand with people, to think about it, to read it, to respond to be able to know it well enough to speak and say, this is why we don't think it'll ever really hold up And that's what Augustine does. But that's what we take from him in the way that he approaches the first 10 books. But there's this guy that Augustine loves to point to, and his name is Varro. Varro preceded Augustine, and so Augustine is using Varro's writing to critique the culture, and Varro is, I should say, a historian. He wrote about 41 volumes called Antiquities about the history of the world, the history of Rome, and so he is a well-established writer and understood what was going on. And all throughout the City of God, if you're going to read the book, you should know the name Varro. He brings him up a lot. And he brings them up in a way that he understands what Varro is saying, but then begins to question how Varro, this historian, approaches his understanding of Rome. Varro, for as much as he wrote, 41 volumes, as I said, held up a sense of civic religion. And civic religion, we're just going to define quickly as the ability to deify government, making the government itself a religious enterprise. Civic religion, where kind of society as a whole looks to the religion as a means of worship. Basically, there's more to be said about that, but we're going to go on from there. So Varro held up a sense of civic religion, deifying government, but then he also created a sense of superstition. Varro believed that certain actions done a certain way at a certain time could create a very specific outcome. Because of Rome's polytheistic worshiping of many gods, polytheistic culture, Varro believed in this kind of superstitious way of life. If I treat the gods appropriately, if I do this at a certain time, if I act in this certain way, I'll get this specific outcome back. And what Augustine points to, he doesn't use this metaphor, I'm going to give you a metaphor, but what Augustine points to is that basically what Rome is doing, what Varro is doing, is creating a scaffolding without a building. He says that there's all this belief in the city of the earth, in the earthly city. There is belief after belief. Even when the city tries to push away belief, he said there's just this residual belief. People are believing in something, but he says there's no object of belief. Belief is found in religion. Belief is found in these many gods that Rome has, but he said there's no real object of belief because belief continues to shift depending on what's going on. Do I believe in the government? Do I believe in one of the gods to do this or another god to do that? Belief never has a defined object. It always moves. And so I kind of liken it to a scaffolding without a building, right? Scaffolding is the racks and the tiers and the metal bars that create places for people to stand on to work on the outside of a building. But scaffolding is useless without a building. Belief needs an object. And so the point that Augustine makes is that there's all this belief that exists within the earthly city that doesn't point to anything specific. And so he's trying to show that there is belief that exists within human nature. And it's for an object. We've just misplaced where that belief goes. It's like scaffolding without a building. It looks like a lot of work, but there's nothing behind it. And this points not only to his culture, but it points to our culture and our desire for meaning and our desire to chase something. The earthly city is packed with the pursuit and chase for meaning, for an object of its belief, but it doesn't have one. And we do the same thing. We desire meaning and we pursue it at almost any cost. There's this great book called Strange Rites, written by Tara Isabella Burton. And she did all this research on kind of the new religion, which the new religion is a belief without an object. It's a desire for meaning, a desire for belief, a desire for community, but with no object. Or the objects shift entirely and quickly. And she says this: we're witnessing the phenomenon that Harvard divinity scholars Casper ter Kuile and Angie Thurston have called unbundling. The rise of bespoke religious identities. The more individualized our religious identities become, the more willing we are to mix and match ideas and practices outside our primary religious affiliation. We're creating a religious identity based on anything that we can find. And one of the things she points to is that it's not just different religious affiliation, that we're placing our religious affiliation in art or in community. And anything that we can find that has any kind of meaning, we will place it onto as long as it works, and then we'll move on to the next thing. The thing that does not change is the desire and pursuit of meaning. So we create religious identities because we always desire something beyond ourselves, a transcendent meaning. Distant from God, apart from God, we will always construct scaffolding. We'll always have desire. We'll always have a religious leaning, a desire for something greater than ourselves. But apart from God, we will always create scaffolding, and the object will be missing. So Augustine is writing about that unbundling, that same thing that's happening in the 5th century. Varro was designing religious identity and affiliation. But for Rome, it was found in government and polytheism, the worship of many gods, as I mentioned before. But Augustine's point is that he couldn't sustain the need of the human soul through Roman government. And to his point, the Roman government, the Roman Empire fell right after, right before Augustine started writing this book. And so his point is, look what happens when we put our hope in civic religion. And he says in polytheism, all these other gods, this kind of panoply of different gods to be able to worship or set our trust in, aren't actually much better than humanity, because the gods were specified by a role. They could only do certain things. The god of wine, the god of war, the god of this or the god of that. They were very clear in what they could do, but also very clear in what they couldn't do. And so Augustine points to and says, listen, you can put your hope in this god to provide wine, but beyond that, they're not much use. And it's not unlike our desire for religious meaning today, where we'll put our hope into anything and desire for anything because it's so great. But if we don't have an object that can sustain that hope, we'll just create scaffolding without a building. Augustine is wanting us to see that there is a fragility in the world that we make for ourselves. That things break and stuff ends, and that if we don't appropriately place our hope, we'll have a hard time getting through. That's not to say all the stuff in the world is bad or wrong or terrible. It just means that in the end, we live in a world of our own making in a lot of ways, and those things break. Our hope has to be ultimately placed in God, who is well beyond our world, but has revealed himself in the person of Jesus. In the first 10 books, Augustine makes this great statement about God who is wholly present, but yet contained in no place. I want to read it to you. He does so, however, as God. That is, he is wholly present in all places and contained in no place. He is not restricted by any bonds. He is not divisible into parts, nor is he changeable in any part. He fills heaven and earth by virtue of his present power, not because his nature is in need of anything beyond itself. Thus he directs all things. He is created in such a way that he allows each to initiate and enact its own proper motions. For although they cannot be anything without him, they are not what he is. In this statement, that quote is Augustine really at his best, describing God in contrasts, but yet filling the whole picture with him. You get a sense of the largeness of God. You can't read Augustine without leaving with a sense that God just fills and spills over into everything that we say and do. But yet if we don't place our hope in God, we just build scaffolding without building. So we understand in these books a need for a different kind of belief, that there is a belief in the earthly city that does not end up working. It does not place itself in anything that will be able to sustain the need for meaning. But that dismantling over the first 10 books propels us into a better and more realistic image of what it means to live and flourish in Christ. Augustine wants us to reach past the earthly city that diminishes, that breaks apart, and see the heavenly city for what it is, to place our hope in the heavenly city, to place and find our peace in the heavenly city. And that happens in books 10 through 22, which we'll look at next week.